Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. Today we have on Bill Sullivan. He's the Showalter Professor at the Indiana University School of Medicine, where he studies infectious disease. He received his PhD in cell and molecular biology from the University of Pennsylvania and has published over 100 papers in scientific journals. An award-winning researcher, teacher, and science communicator, Bill has been featured in a wide variety of outlets, including CNN, Fox and Friends, CBS News, ESPN, The Doctors, New York Post, Wall Street Journal, TEDx, The Scientist, and many more. Today we'll be discussing his book, Pleased to Meet Me, Genes, Germs, and the Curious Forces That Make Us Who We Are. Bill, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for being here.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. It's wonderful to be here on Seize the Moment.
I love it. And so, as we tend to do, I'm going to read a passage from Bill's book. Bill wrote, "Differences between people arise from differences in their DNA sequence. Although many acknowledge that DNA builds their fleshy edifice, most don't realize that genes have an impact on more complicated characteristics as well, such as intelligence, happiness, or aggression. In some cases, how genetics affects our body is straightforward. Sometimes a change in a single gene, referred to as a mutant or a variant, produces an alteration that is highly predictable. One example is sickle cell anemia, which results when red blood cells are misshapen. It is caused by a mutation in the gene that makes hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in red blood cells. People are born with this mutation in their hemoglobin gene. People that are born with this mutation in their hemoglobin gene will develop sickle cell anemia, no question about it. In contrast, more complicated traits, such as those that influence personality and behavior, arise from many genes working in concert with one another. Variations in a single gene within such a network don't always guarantee a perceptible change in the organism. This is why it is essential to keep in mind that most genetic variants tell us about predispositions, not certainties." So genes, for anybody who knows, I'm sure many people listening, it's a really, really complicated topic. So this is the second time we're actually talking about the topic. So we had on author, she's a neurologist, Sarah Manning-Peskin on. This was now like 2 years ago. So, and the questions that we have for her, I think a lot of them we're going to also have for you, because I think for us, just as people who live out in the world and deal with more concrete things, it's kind of hard to grasp like how genes work. And so let me just give you guys like a quick example. So I remember when I was in graduate school, so as people who don't know, I'm a psychotherapist, and I remember we were learning about genes and how genes affect like mental health and stuff. And so I remember in the book, which was sort of well written, sort of not, there was this concept of like the shy gene, And so I remember thinking like, well, wow, like there's such a, and this book was like from the 80s. So I remember thinking like, wow, there's such a thing as a shy gene. And then you come to find out, okay, that there's no such thing as a shy gene. So Bill, my question to you is, how do we start to wrap our minds around like how genetics works? When again, I think the way most people like to think of, whether they do or don't maybe like to think of, but they do tend to think of it as sort of simple cells and simple mechanisms causing simple traits, right? So you start to argue that that's actually more or less not the case. And very, like, obviously, very rarely is it kind of I guess it's a single sort of gene involved in a particular complex trait. Obviously we talked about sickle cell anemia, but for the most part, I mean, it's really, really complex. So how does the layperson start to get their mind around pretty much how genes work? And just before we even get into behavior, how it actually, let's say, impacts particular like traits that we see?
Mm-hmm.
No, that's a great question, and I'm glad you started off with that, because it lays a nice foundation for where I imagine our conversation is going to go. And you really hit the nail on the head. And one of the motivations for writing this book and putting so much emphasis on DNA at the front of the book was to articulate a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about genes, chromosomes, and DNA, which pretty much all mean the same thing. But lay audiences who haven't had any biology since maybe elementary or middle school really don't know a great deal about what we mean when we say there is a gene for X or there is a gene for Y. So the passage that you highlighted from Pleased to Meet Me is perfect, because it brings in one of the key classic examples of where a single gene, and in fact, a single point mutation, which is a very minor substitution in the genetic sequence, can have a very profound effect. And in this case, sickle cell anemia. There's other examples out there like Huntington's disease, a genetic mutation, a very simple base pair substitution in DNA sequence will inevitably cause Huntington's disease. It's like almost 100% probability. But then when you talk about books or scientists or journalists who say there's a gene for shyness, or there's a gene for violence or aggression. There's a gene for drug addiction. There's no such thing. You know, we are composed of at least 20,000 genes. And yes, the whole human genome has been sequenced, so we have a pretty good idea of what most of our genes are. But we have a very infantile understanding of how they work together amongst themselves in what we call gene networks. And more importantly, which is another big part of my book, is this concept of epigenetics, which is how the environment works with our genes. You know, scientists no longer think about these things as separate entities. We no longer divide it into nature versus nurture, because we now realize and appreciate that those are two sides of the same coin. But for the purposes of this discussion, I think it's important to illustrate that things like sickle cell, Huntington's, and certain types of cancer, which can be caused by a single change, a mutation in DNA sequence, are kind of the exception and not the rule. When we're talking about more complex things like personality and behavior, or even some physical traits like height, okay? Those sorts of things are controlled by hundreds, maybe thousands of different genes. So if you find a study that says this gene's correlated with shyness or aggression, for example, what that really means is that this genetic mutation in a significantly number size of people correlates with a certain physical or behavioral attribute. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to manifest that way. What we need to keep in mind is that there's a strong environmental component. At the end of the day, genes make proteins. That's all they do. And proteins collectively govern the function of our cells, which then govern the function of the organ those cells are in, which then orchestrates the behavior of the organism itself. So genes are very reductionistic, and they often don't paint the big picture for us, but they can be really important tools and indicators for certain aspects of disease and possibly behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember reading when you mentioned so I don't remember the exact genes involved, but the genes involved with breast cancer. So there were two that you particularly mentioned, and then you essentially noted that it's not necessarily the case. First of all, that obviously everybody who has those genes will obviously end up developing breast cancer, but then on top of that, you can actually end up developing breast cancer without having those genes. So can you talk a little bit about that, and also this is kind of a harder question, but let's say for the layperson, how would they look at this and not feel kind of dejected and feel like, wait, how did they even really then know? Because it seems like it's kind of like a crapshoot. Sometimes these genes are involved, sometimes they aren't. Like, how does this even make sense?
It makes sense when you funnel down and look at things at a very deeply reductionistic, in a reductionistic way. So like when we're talking about physical attributes or certain genetic diseases, some of the explanations are profoundly simple, okay? Cancer can be one of them, because if we have all sorts of genes that regulate how a cell grows, okay, how it divides, and then how it shuts off division, how the cell knows to stop growing. There's a lot of different genes that govern that basic activity, the cell cycle. If any of those genes get mutated, okay, say that it gets hit by UV light from the sun, or say fall into a vat of radioactive waste, those sorts of things are going to cause a genetic mutation. And if that happens, the protein changes. And that protein, which might have stopped cells from growing, may no longer function that way. It could be like a non-functional protein, and therefore the cell keeps growing. And the cells that it makes keeps growing. And that's basically what cancer is. It's a cell growing out of control, which can always be linked to some kind of genetic mutation. Sometimes it's just one. Sometimes there has to be several that accumulate and pass a certain threshold for that cell to become cancerous. And at the end of the day, those are pretty simple explanations. Scientists can understand those quite well. And with the power of gene editing, we can maybe even go in and fix those sorts of problems, okay, in the near future. What gets a lot more complicated is when we're talking about traits Let's move away from cancer for a moment and talk about height, because height is a simple trait that most people understand. Most people appreciate that that's a genetically derived trait, much like eye color or whether your hair is curly. Those are pretty simple traits. And you'd think height is pretty simple too, but height can be governed by at least 100 different genes. And let's say someone has the genetic potential to, on average, grow to be 6 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
You take that person or as an infant and put them into a malnourished environment, okay, or an environment with a lot of other stressors, they're not going to reach that genetic potential of 6 feet because the environment was not optimized for their genes. Okay, malnutrition is not going to give that person the necessary building blocks, regardless of what genetic predisposition they have, to reach 6 feet. So this is a revolutionary discovery and has opened the doors for epigenetics, which is a relatively new science that I was able to get in on the ground floor when I started my lab about 24 years ago. This idea that there are factors in the environment that can change how our genes are expressed, not which genes we have, has nothing to do with genetic mutations, but it can change how those genes are expressed, whether they're on, off, or anywhere in between. And you put those sorts of volume knobs or dimmer switchers, if you will, onto all the 20,000 genes we have, you realize there's a lot of different versions of you that are possible within your genome than, the person that I'm sitting here talking to right now. In a different environment. If you would have grown up in a different environment, you could potentially be a very different person than who you are today. And that's because of epigenetics.
Right. Yeah, and I love the way you frame it as a dimmer switch, because the way we tend to think about it, and again, this is the way I was sort of more or less taught about it in grad school, is that it's like you have a predisposition and then sort of the environment kind of triggers it, right? Or it sort of activates it. But the way you express it is actually way more nuanced than that, that it's actually more or less a dimmer switch rather than just like a light switch, right? So can you tell us about the distinction and why that's important?
Yeah, and I was taught the same thing, back when I was in school, that genes were kind of binary. They were either on or they were off.
Right.
And epigenetics has opened our minds to the fact that there's a lot of activity that goes into whether a gene gets expressed or not, gets made into the protein that it is encoding. So yeah, you can, based on the environment that you were in, your genes could be completely off, on just a little bit, on a lot, or on at their maximum level. And, like I said, anywhere in between, like that dimmer switch. And that gives you great flexibility as to whether or not that particular gene is going to bring about a certain behavior or physical trait. A good illustration that might help listeners understand is what we call discordant identical twins. Okay, this is a mystery that baffled scientists for decades. Why do identical twins who have the same exact genome differ as they get older? A lot of people think identical twins are always the same, but that's not always the case. They're what we call discordant for certain traits. Some of the most striking examples are, one twin can be a little more aggressive and angrier than the other twin. One can be obese while the other stays lean. These are what we call discordant traits for aggression or obesity. And in the old dogma, that shouldn't really be the case, because gene for gene, they are identical clones of one another. How can they possibly be different? So scientists, when epigenetics was discovered, started looking at classic epigenetic markers in very young twins and much older twins. And this particular epigenetic modification is what scientists call DNA methylation. And I'm not going to get too much into the weeds, don't worry. DNA methylation simply is a chemical modification that takes place in or around a gene. Or the proteins that associate with those genes. So it's not a mutation in the genetic sequence. It's It's a different type of modification, and it's one that's reversible. A mutation is not reversible. The epigenetic changes are theoretically reversible.
Hmm.
So this DNA methylation, the more DNA methylation marks that are on a gene, the more it's dialed down, okay? And if there are an abundance of DNA methylation marks on a gene, it can be completely shut off. So what scientists found was they made a marker for this DNA methylation, and they can look at all the chromosomes in very young twins, okay? And they find that not only are they identical gene for gene, they are almost identical in their DNA methylation patterns as well.
Wow.
Now you look at 50-year-old twins or older, and the DNA methylation patterns are very different, strikingly different, but the gene sequence is still the same. Okay, so they're still identical twins, gene for gene, but they're expressing their genes at different levels. And that is thought to bring about the differences in behaviors or physical traits.
Yeah, super interesting, because then the question is going to be, how do twins end up differing if they are raised more or less in the same environment? Is it that they're, I don't know, I guess it's like the small changes or the small differences matter? Would it be something else, or is it just a complete mystery at this point?
Oh, yeah, that's an excellent question. And it very well could be small changes, like you mentioned. Small changes can have a very profound effect on someone's behavior. So when we talk about twins being raised in a similar environment, we're talking about very crude analysis, right? We're talking, okay, maybe the same family, same socioeconomic environment, but they may have very different exposures to the type, the friends they're attracted to or the activities that they do. One might have been mugged, whereas another never had been. That can profoundly change how one views the world moving forward. One can have an injury that the other one does not. Okay, so there's all sorts of different nuances in the micro environment, I would say. Even though the macro environment seems similar, there are nuances within that macro environment that can certainly lead to epigenetic differences in those twins.
Oh, very interesting. So, Al, wait, do you want to?
It-
I actually want to I want to ask you a question, and then I want to get into like now a super, super difficult topic. So, all right, this is the question that I would have for you. So, even though I'm sure you can tell, or you get a sense, right? So, let's say, you're kind of born a certain way, you have certain physical traits, right? I would say more or less for any of us, that's kind of easy to grasp, right? Like,
Sure.
let's say, I have a particular height, whatever predisposition to weight or whatever, right? But do you ever get the sense that it's kind of weird that genes like dictate your personality? That a lot of like, kind of your preferences, a lot of your decisions are actually influenced by that? Because I still like, for me, I think, just like for most other people, probably like we kind of get this sense, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a minute. Or probably even right now, we get this sense where like this kind of ghost in the machine, like we're like a soul or something, right? And we just have like infinite free will. Like we're like, how do our genes, like these little like markers that we can't even necessarily even see with our eyes, like how they affect us? Like, do you ever think about that?
Well, I definitely do think that I have some sort of autonomy, right?
Mhm.
Or at least I feel that way,
Right.
right? And of course, yes, I do understand that my genes predispose me for certain physical traits, personality type, that sort of thing, how I express myself, right? But then I also think, I have some sort of sovereignty over that.
Right.
Maybe I can put myself into a different environment, change some aspects, some variables in order to then alter how, those genes express themselves. So, for instance, being very basic, but let's say height.
Mhm.
Okay, well, I have what's called a dowager's hump, right? So, and most people who are sedentary and, sit all the time at work, they usually kind of, bend their head and they might form a little bit of a hump, and that actually reduces your height.
Mm.
Funny enough, I went to a doctor recently and he tells me, oh, after I checked your x-ray, apparently you've lost about 3 to 4 inches of height.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's
so
substantial.
that's
Yeah.
quite substantial. Yeah, and so I'm 5'9". I could have been 6 foot.
What?
I'm over 6 foot
Oh my
actually, or just
God.
about 6 foot.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter so much, of course. We have these bizarre values when it comes to height and things like that. But there is something in the back of my head that's like, it could have been 6 foot. Oh my
Right.
God, if only I walked straighter and all of that. And then I'm asking the doctor, is there anything else I can do? He's like, well, yes, you can, try to fix your posture, that sort of thing, and maybe somewhat mediate, what's going on with that hump. And
Mhm.
So that's cool. So apparently, maybe if I put some sort of conscious effort into doing something like
Mm.
that, I can change something about how my height is currently expressing itself.
Oh, so then I have a more philosophical question for you
Yeah.
then. So do you get the sense that when it comes to your genetic makeup, do you feel like more or less it's inevitable, or do you feel more or less like you have enough free will to actually be able to, I don't know, quote unquote, master your destiny?
Okay. Well, I think within a certain parameter, especially ever since I first learned about epigenetics,
Hmm.
right? And the ways that the environment can have an effect on how your genes are expressed, then of course, I mean, the way I view it is, maybe there's a sort of a boundary
Hmm.
of all the allowable, um, I suppose, let's put it like this, like the traits the way a trait can be expressed
Right.
with a particular gene or set of genes. And I have this bound, right?
Hmm.
But then the way that I behave in the, no, not that I behave in the environment, sorry. The way that what the environment that I'm placed in may within that bound allow, that dimmer switch that we
Right.
just discussed, maybe to go higher or lower,
Right.
for lack of a better way to sort of express that. And so, I mean, I feel like I have something I can work with in
Right.
terms of how those genes are expressed. But do I feel like, there's some sort of master,
Hmm.
not master
Like a
gene, but
puppeteer.
yeah, like as
Mhm.
if I can sort of act with like outside of those bounds.
Right.
Not quite, but yes, I do feel some level of freedom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Bill, so this is going to be my question to you, because oftentimes when we have debates about free will and determinism, people can really conceptualize it in this really binary way, and which is obviously wrong. But here's my question for you, right? So if we have a tendency to either view ourselves as being these kind of subjective, kind of free willing beings, right? And then that's supposed to, like, let's say maybe us thinking about ourselves as being kind of, I don't know, buttressed around or sort of pushed around by our genes, like, what Dawkins would call the selfish genes, right? How would you kind of express that to people, or how would you help them make sense of the fact that yes, they are sort of cognitive volitional beings on the one hand, but then on the other hand, their behavior and personality is dictated by their
And
genes?
can I add something super
Sure.
quick? And what is the concept of free won't? Why not? Because yeah,
Yeah, go
yeah,
for it.
yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I think if you guys don't mind, I'm going to address the free won't part of this first,
Sure.
because I
Okay.
think that's an interesting point, and it'll allow us to introduce experiments that have put free will into doubt. So one of the classic experiments in this arena of philosophies and science are Benjamin Libet's early studies in the 1980s. And to simplify his setup, he basically had subjects decide to press a button
Mhm.
when the clock reached a certain time. Okay. And he's like, press the button when you think you've made this decision, um, about the time or whatever. Um, what really happened, and he was visualizing brain activity in these subjects as they were
Mhm.
doing this experiment. And long story short, what he observed is that there was brain activity preceding when the subject thought they were consciously making a decision. And this opened up the idea, and there's multiple interpretations, but most neuroscientists interpret this experiment as the brain already made a decision, and then you became conscious of what the brain did
Mhm.
after the fact. And this is consistent with a lot of neuroscientists who say that the brain consciousness itself is basically a reality generating machine. Okay.
Mhm.
Consciousness exists to tell us what the brain has already subconsciously decided to do. And it takes this ghost in the machine completely out of the equation. Okay. Rene Descartes was profoundly wrong if you interpret Libet's experiment that way. There is no dualism, there's no soul that floats around in the body that is disconnected from our mental processes and trying to act as a decider, if you will.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay. Everything boils back down to the brain. And I would take that even one step further and say, well, what built the brain? You guys tell me.
Yeah.
Genes.
Proteins. Yeah.
Genes that make proteins that build the brain.
Yep.
So the brain is actually a device that is created by genes for genes, and it works to serve genes. Okay. But here's where things get really interesting. Genes, I think, outdid themselves. Okay. And they created a brain that is so complicated that it figured out what genes are up to. Okay. It like pulled the curtain back on them, like in The Wizard of Oz, and found that, okay, I know how genes and DNA work now. And now I even know how the environment can tweak these genes. So maybe I can be somewhat of a master of my own, of my own fate, because I see what's going on here. And that's something we can get back into later. But let me circle back to free won't. This was actually Libet's idea, because he was so disturbed by the findings of his study and the idea that there might not be free will after all, and that consciousness is just generated so that it can explain what the brain is doing. Libet wasn't comfortable with that. So he kind of threw this Hail Mary pass and came up with this concept of free won't, which is basically a veto power that we, meaning some kind of consciousness or soul or spirit, however you want to call it, can then jump in and say, no, time out, we're not going to do that. The genes and the brain give some kind of impulse. Okay, you said something I don't like, I'm going to hit you. But Libet would argue, no, we have free won't, which means we are going to veto that impulse to hit somebody because we know it's wrong. So that's the concept of free won't. And I think, it was attractive to me at first. I thought, okay, that's an interesting point. But it really doesn't answer the question, because it's just the inverse of free will. And if you say free will doesn't exist, I really don't think you can be genuine and say, well, free won't is different. It's not. It's just semantics. Yeah, because you can always argue it back one step further. Well, where does the impulse to stop an impulse come from? And you can get into these infinite loops that are really annoying. So, there's, and we should say, just not only for your guys' knowledge, but for all the listeners, this is not a settled matter in neuroscience. Some of the top neuroscientists are still arguing about this concept today, and it's hindered in part because we truly don't really understand what consciousness is yet. We know it arises from the brain and it's completely dependent on the brain. I'm not suggesting that there's some kind of supernatural or woo-woo element associated with it. I'm perfectly comfortable with the fact that consciousness arises from something that is completely material. But what fascinates me is that this immaterial entity, if you will, thought and consciousness, can have an effect on the brain moving forward. We don't quite know how that happens yet. Maybe consciousness does have some sort of physical property that we will ultimately be able to measure. Okay, brain waves, for example, do seem to correlate with many aspects of consciousness and decision making and emotions. So maybe that's it. And maybe those waves can interact with what we call mechanosensitive channels on neurons. They respond to things like sound waves or maybe brain waves in ways that our best scientists haven't quite articulated yet. But those channels may pick up those sorts of brain waves, and then you have a very materialistic explanation for how thought can come back and affect neuronal tissue in the brain. So that, I think, is pretty fascinating. And whether or not we have some sort of autonomy over our actions, I don't know. I don't see a lot of hope for that hypothesis the more I think about it. Despite, Alan, I totally agree with you. I feel that way all the time. There's not a decision in my life I don't make where I don't feel like there's something independent inside of me that's making that decision. But I have to stay open to the possibility that it is completely material, and we will understand how this is happening one day. And as I got to the end of the book, because I went into researching and writing Pleased to Meet Me with the idea that I would be able to take this knowledge and kind of prove that we have free will, because epigenetics kind of opened that door to me. It's like, well, if epigenetics can tweak our gene activity and they're controlled by things in the environment, well, then I should be able to reconstruct my environment to do whatever I want.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Within the confines of the genes I have. So that gave me a lot of hope as I was writing this book. And then I started to do a lot more research into the brain and this free will question. And I'm like, oh, I don't think I'm right anymore. I think these materialists have very compelling arguments, and I can't think of a way out of them. Okay. So I concluded the book very much like you kind of were suggesting, Alan. There's like this, if you imagine free will as a large circle, and then you think about DNA. Oh, okay, well, we don't control the cards we're dealt with at birth, right? We don't control what genes we're born with. So that shrinks the free will circle quite a bit right there. And then you think about epigenetics as kind of an escape route, but then you think, well, I didn't control what family I was born into. I didn't control what environment I was born into. You know, all throughout my youth, there were lots of things that were decided for me, and those formidable years were not under my control. So the circle shrinks again. And then there's all sorts of things that can happen to your brain as you age. You know, in addition to aging itself, it can become infected. It can get a tumor. You can get hit on the head.
Yeah.
You can take medications or get lead poisoning. All sorts of things can degrade, you know, the potential, you know, cognitive capacity that your brain has. And that shrinks the circle of free will even more. So I don't know how large the bird cage is at the end of the day, but there's still a little part of me that hopes we can still sing our own tune, even though we're encaged in all these biological factors that seem that we don't have any control over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so Bill, I want to get your kind of take on this. I don't know if you've heard of it. Maybe you have, obviously, maybe you haven't. So we had on psychologists Ken and Sheldon on, and this was like what, 2 years ago, I think now.
Positive psychology.
Yeah. So Kenan is a huge proponent of free will. So the way he describes the Libet experiments is like this. And so I'll just tell you what he said, and then I'll give you my take, and then I'm just curious what yours would be. So Ken said, like, look, this is the thing that doesn't really come up in, I guess, the popular understanding of the Libet experiments. He says, okay, even though, yes, that's true, there is such a thing as pre-consciousness, like nobody in the free will kind of camp, right? Nobody doubts that, right? But he says the issue is that they don't really sort of go back and ask themselves, yes, but is there a decision already made? So Ken essentially says that before the person even sits down to make a decision about, like, I don't know what time something happened or what time they made a decision, he says even before then there was already a primer, right? Or the mind was rather already primed. So meaning they've already made a decision beforehand to sit down to engage in the experiment. And so in some ways, like, the brain was already ready to make a decision. And then once you're finally making a decision, that's just like the end of it, right? My issue with that would just be the issue of kind of infinite regress, because if then you're just saying that, then you could say, well, pre-consciousness at that moment when you decided to sit down in the chair, partake in the experiment, whatever, at some point you can say that, well, you know, pre-consciousness was activated. And again, you know, you sort of, you only became aware of the fact after the fact that, you know, after your mind already made the decision. But have you ever heard of that, Bill, of like this issue of like being primed and just the fact that, like, again, even though people are making decisions in that moment, there's actually a sort of pre-choice that can more or less, you know, kind of prime the brain or get the brain ready to make a decision.
Yeah, I would have made the same point that you just did.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you guys have read Sapolsky's book Determined, which is a dense analysis of the free will question.
Mm-hmm.
And his argument at the end of the day, which addresses this infinite regression problem, is that I will be a free will convert. I guess I should, for the listeners who don't know this, Sapolsky is anti-free will. He doesn't think it exists at all in any capacity whatsoever. And he argues at the end of the day, I will convert to free will belief if you show me how a neuron can produce neurotransmitters that lead to a decision completely, you know, outside of its own cellular processes. And that is a really hard argument to poke holes in. So Kevin Mitchell tried. He wrote a book called Free Agents, And that is kind of the counter argument. And he's got a neuroscience background as well. So it's very interesting to see two prominent neuroscientists tackling this question virtually at the same time. And his main argument, he can't defeat Sapolsky's question. I don't think anybody can. But Kevin argues that it's too reductionistic. And we're failing to appreciate when we look at things under the microscope to that degree, we are failing to see other potential layers of this question. Okay, so if we look at individual neurons, yeah, of course, there's not going to be like some kind of outside mystical thing telling a neuron what to do. Okay, there's always going to be a cause for its effect. And Mitchell argues, and I can't profess that I completely understand his arguments, something along the lines of what we've been talking about earlier, where there's a more complex layer of neurocognitive activity that is occurring in our brains that leaves open the possibility that during our contemplation, when we are thinking about pros and cons of various decisions, there is some sort of brain activity, if you will. I hesitate to call it a soul because I don't believe Kevin thinks that it's supernatural in any way, shape, or form. But he believes that the brain is capable of generating what we feel as the self that can evaluate distinct choices and make a decision. And he argues that's the ticket for free will. And that's the upper level, and an upper level of cognition that cannot be addressed simply by looking at individual neurons.
Right.
So I think the argument at the end of the day is unsettled, and whether you fall into either camp, I think you can make a good case for either one.
Yeah, so the way I remember Ken describing it was he said they're strata, and then he said we're just going to more, not more, I guess dense maybe is the right term, but sort of deeper levels into kind of like materialism, I guess if you want to call it that. And so he says essentially at the top is what we call like the mind, like you could call it the spirit. It doesn't matter. He certainly didn't mean it like religiously or anything like that. But essentially he says like all of these kind of affect each other, and it's sort of bottom up and then it's top down. But yeah, the thing about that is that for me, it's like even if that's the case, even if there is a sort of top-down approach, I mean, technically, if our brains affect our environments, like why shouldn't our brains be able to affect themselves? In some ways, we are also part of the environment. So I think the split, at least I'm not saying Ken is making this mistake, but I think in like common understanding, just to go back again to like determinism and free will, I think what people like find so hard, why it's so hard for people to see that again, it's all sort of one thing, is because when we think about the mind, it's kind of hard. If we separate the mind from the environment, we'll say, okay, here's like us, and then here's out there. So it's kind of hard for us to see, well, like, no, the brain can act on itself because it is a part of the environment. There really is no actual split. So again, when people think about the split between free will and determinism, they think like, well, free will is like this agent, and then there's everything else. So it's like, it's sort of us acting on the world, where it's like, no, we are a part of the world. So in some ways, it's like the world acting on the world. And I think for all of us, myself included, it's sort of a hard concept to grasp.
I mean, what's interesting about that, I mean, honestly, whether free will exists or doesn't, right? Say we were just operating on the fact that it's just an illusion, right? Let's say that was the settled argument. Either way, we still, I mean, I may be being very reductionistic at the moment, but even if that's the case, if you believe in free will and act as if there's free will, I mean, yes, there may not actually be free will, but let's say, for instance, in your environment, you find out from reading Bill's book, the microbiome, the microbiota, for example, can influence how I behave and how I feel, right? Okay, well, then maybe I should get my gut biome checked. I happen to have depressive symptoms, just as an example. Okay, that might not necessarily be the cause, but it could be a factor. Maybe I get that checked out, and by the way, I don't know the actual, I'm not going to attempt to say I know the solution would be like a probiotic or something. I don't think it's that simple. But say like, you do something like physical in order to create some sort of a change in your body that might affect your mood, let's say, right? Yeah. Okay, whether or not that was of your own free will or your brain you know, or just it's just sort of predetermined
Right.
in order to still benefit yourself. That does it matter?
Oh, actually, I'm gonna use your question and piggyback off of that, and actually ask Bill a question.
Okay.
So, Bill, and that's actually a great starting point. So, Bill, this is the problem that I would say a lot of us have in the psychology field. So, people will often say, well, if you, and they say this to me because I bring this up a decent amount of times. They'll say, well, if you're a determinist, then like, what the fuck am I doing in therapy, right? So, if it's all just determined from like day one, how is any of this helpful, right? If I don't have free will, why would I be able to affect myself? And again, this goes back to that dichotomy of free will as opposed to determinism. So yeah, so Bill, so does it actually matter? And if it does matter, right, how do we sort of address the question of like, let's say if we agree that it is determinism, right? How do we then address the question of like, wait, how do I help myself if it's all just predetermined?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think a lot of people get confused about some of these issues because you can have something that is completely predetermined, but if you're in the middle of it, in the thick of it, and you're ignorant as to what the outcome's going to be, it really doesn't matter. It's going to feel like you're in the driver's seat, or at least you're a participant in this. And it's like, if you think about a movie, okay, any movie out there, it's predetermined. The script's written, the acting's done, the story is set. If you haven't seen the movie, it's not predetermined to you. You don't know what's going to happen next. And that's exactly how life plays out. So I think just because life is predetermined certainly doesn't take away any of the magic or the majesty that is associated with living, and any of the emotions that are associated with the surprises or the decisions that we encounter during the movie of our lives. So I think there is still a lot of value in things like talk therapy, where you can get people to see a certain behavior or come to some sort of realization that might improve their well-being in some way moving forward. I think that has tremendous value, and whether we're predetermined or not, that doesn't factor into it at all. Not if I'm understanding your question correctly. I think that's a important misconception that you raised. Just because life is predetermined certainly doesn't take away any of the magic for us.
Yeah, and let me just, the way I understand it when people mention or say something like that is the way that they're, so I, because now I really want to get into the territory of mental health. So the way that they say it or the way that they think about it is, oh, okay, so if I have like, let's say I'm just going to throw a particular diagnosis. So let's say if I have schizophrenia, right? So if you're a determinist and I have schizophrenia, what you're ultimately saying is there's nothing I can do about the schizophrenia and I'm just going to have schizophrenia for the rest of my life. So that's how people tend to misunderstand mental illness in the context of determinism, right? So, but now here's the real question. So first of all, I'm going to try to get into like personality stuff. So what do we actually know about how genes affect personality? As you know, you mentioned that genes code for proteins, they don't code for behaviors, right? So then people are going to say, well, but then how do they affect behaviors? I mean, this is like, the million dollar question. And then the second, and then this is the, like, I guess, follow-up question here. The second question would be, how would we then instill hope in people if we are determinists? And, again, they're saying, well, if you're a determinist and I have, let's say, schizophrenia, doesn't that mean I can't do anything about it?
Yeah, well, let's take that schizophrenia as an example. Just because there is a disease state, you can look at schizophrenia, you can even look at something outside of mental health like cancer. It doesn't mean that there's absolutely nothing you can't do to help the problem. Okay, if that was the case in the cancer situation, we would not have people undergoing surgery to remove tumors or undergoing chemotherapy to try to do something about the disease, because we're getting better and better at devising strategies that can defeat cancer, or at least put it into remission. And I think mental health needs to be reanalyzed in that same framework, because mental health, at the end of the day, schizophrenia, we don't fully understand what the mechanism behind it is. There certainly does seem to be a genetic component. There seems to be a brain inflammation component, which could mean there's an environmental component. And I don't know for 100% with 100% certainty, but I venture to guess that someone out there has tried to link the microbiome to schizophrenia, because the microbiome seems to be linked to anything these days. And some of those studies are good, some are not. But even the microbe that I study in my laboratory on a day-to-day basis, this Toxoplasma gondii parasite, which infects an astonishing 1/3 of the human population, and it sits in the brain for the rest of your life,
Wow.
has been linked to schizophrenia predisposition more strongly than any single gene has.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it's really remarkable. And when you and it could be a combination of these things, right? So there could be someone with a certain genetic predisposition who gets an infection, either by the Toxoplasma parasite, maybe some other infection that causes brain inflammation. And it's that constellation of circumstances that ultimately brings about schizophrenia that could affect the patient. All this knowledge that we're accumulating might seem very confusing, but that's the road that needs to be taken. We're not going to sort out this disease and come up with better treatments until we figure out what the biological basis for it is. And it's kind of interesting that the more we study these sorts of neuropsychoses, okay, and start seeing some of the underlying biology behind it, whether it be serotonin receptors or brain inflammation or brain parasites or even environmental triggers, okay, which plenty of them have been associated with schizophrenia, which brings in a possible epigenetic component as well.
Right.
This might seem really confusing and off-putting at the moment, but what this is teaching us, in addition to maybe fostering treatments down the road for mental illness, is that all these behaviors have a biological basis. And that might seem to unsettle a lot of people because it does eat away at free will. It's corrosive to agency, but that knowledge is power. And if we learn how to master it, which we ultimately will, we will not only be able to help patients overcome mental illness, we'll have a much more firm understanding as to what life is all about, which gets into purpose and meaning and so on. So I think that tackles one element of your question, but you also had a question about personality. Did I miss that one?
Yeah. Well, so in terms of how, so when we think of personality, actually, let me use this as now as a backdrop. So like the parasite, right? This is to me like the scariest thing ever. So you mentioned how essentially when mice get infected with these parasites, they essentially become less afraid of cats. And if anything, they actually like veer toward them and they become aggressive toward cats, right? So when we think of personalities, it's often hard for us to think that they're pretty much not set in stones, but they're affected either by genes, by parasites, whatever, right? So I don't now remember exactly what my question was about personality, but I will ask this one. So how do we start to explain to people that essentially, like, even though, yes, it feels like you're in control, to some sense you are, but it feels like you're in control of your personality on the one hand, but then on the other hand, like, and in this very scary way, you can have a parasite actually infect you and you could become maybe not a whole different person, but in the case of the mouse, it was. What did you want?
No. Well, I'll bring up something.
Okay.
Well, there are some interesting studies that have correlated the presence of Toxoplasma infection in people to certain behaviors.
Yep.
And they align with that risk-taking phenotype that you've illustrated for the rodents who are no longer afraid of cats. In fact, they're no longer afraid of any stimuli that would make an uninfected rodent run for the hills. So it's a striking risk-taking phenotype. And in humans who test positive for Toxoplasma, and in America, that's like 1 out of 5 people, you get risk-taking behavior. You see a correlation between more compulsive gamblers have Toxoplasma.
Wow.
People are 3 times more likely to be in a car wreck if they have Toxoplasma. So there's a real striking parallel there. And granted, those are correlations, so we should put in the caveat that it's not a causation by any means. But to get to your point, it illustrates that personality is not something that is set in stone. There are not only environmental factors like infections that can affect personality. We know for a fact that age can affect it. We are not the same people, when we're older than we were younger. And teenagers are not the same people that they were when they were in their terrible twos. So we're changing all the time. And I think there's a huge misconception amongst the lay public that personality is static and, that people simply don't change. And that's a myth, that's demonstrably false with just simple thought experiments. And that again, it's a complex interplay between genes and environment, because one of the reasons why people kind of mellow out when they get older, most people on average, not everybody, is hormonal changes. And those are linked to changes in the brain that are ultimately linked to changes in our genetic program. So, yeah, and I think we should be happy about that, because we're not locked into one particular fate. We are malleable, and we can make changes for the better. And that's why I think, talking about these sorts of things in the context of psychotherapy is a wonderful game changer for a lot of people. Sometimes even better than actual drugs. Not to say that they never do any good, but I think a lot of progress can be made simply by orienting how people think and how they view the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you want to say
absolutely.
something related to this? Or?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. So funny enough, you mentioned parasites. So this is not necessarily a parasite, or maybe it is. I forget. But there's candida, right? And certain and carbohydrates, which essentially make, like, just by the very fact of just eating a bunch of carbs, you get candida in your body, which wants more
Mm.
carbs, and it's sort of like there's this like sort of like feedback loop where you just keep kind of craving carbs. And if I'm not mistaken, also makes you generate more ghrelin in the body, making you way more hungry. And maybe otherwise you would have been satiated. I'm kind of forgetting this. This is something I checked out a while ago.
Well,
But
you're
yeah,
certainly in the ballpark.
yeah,
There are microbes in our gut,
yeah.
mostly bacteria, but some fungi like Candida it is.
Interesting.
And collectively, they make substances that can drive certain food cravings, cravings for high sugar, high fat, and things like that. And in fact, if you take microbiota from an obese human being and put it into a mouse, that mouse will start to overeat and become obese as well. So
Wow.
your point is very well taken, and there's a lot of science to support. And again, this is a correlation. It's not that the microbes like seem to cause this, but compelling evidence. If you take those same bacteria out of a human being and put them into a mouse, and then the mouse starts to get obese, there's certainly a microbiome component to the obesity question, at least for some people.
Mm.
Now, the
Wow.
most fascinating thing, you mentioned candida, so it brought up this fascinating thing that relates to behavior into my head.
Mhm.
There's this thing, I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It's called autobrewery disease.
Mm-mm.
No.
This is when a fungus overgrows in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
And people might be totally grossed out by that, but that's perfectly natural to have. You got fungus in your gut, whoever you are. I'm sorry if that grosses you out, but it's usually doing a good thing. Okay, only under rare circumstances does it get pathogenic.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a very rare condition, but in a handful of people, this particular fungus can grow out of control. And if they consume carbohydrates, this particular yeast will break those carbohydrates down into alcohol, and they will start having really high levels of blood alcohol without
Wow.
taking a single drink. So they can get literally drunk
Mhm.
and pulled over for a DUI because they had a plate of pasta.
Oh man.
It's Go Google this
Yeah.
later. It's
Yeah.
fascinating. It's
Officer,
called
no, I just had some marinara sauce,
I
man.
just had chicken
and
I
parm, sir.
know.
Yeah.
yeah, I had a bagel. What are you talking about? I'm not
Wow.
Yeah.
drunk. And that's exactly how most of these cases are discovered. These people are completely unaware that they have this condition. They just might feel a little buzzed all the time. And they probably have a super high tolerance for alcohol because they're constantly being exposed to it.
Mhm.
But yeah, they usually get pulled over for a DUI, insist that they're not drinking, and a good lawyer who is aware of this weird condition will have them tested for it. Okay. And lo and behold, they were telling the truth the whole time. They were not drunk. And it was just this fungus. And you give them like antifungal drugs that will reduce this pathogen in the gut,
Mhm.
and that this alcohol generated from carbohydrates doesn't happen anymore.
Mhm.
So it's a really remarkable thing that ties back into personality issues, because what if these people with autobrewery disease tend to be a little more positive, happy-go-lucky, because they're kind of a little drunk all the time. Okay,
Mhm. Mhm.
not to the
Wow.
point where they're like jumping up and dancing on cars and stuff like that, but they just a little more, loose and relaxed. And then they get treated for this condition, they could potentially become a completely different person.
Wow.
Same with toxoplasma. This is currently incurable, but let's say toxoplasma gets into someone's brain, makes them more impulsive, makes them a risk taker. There's one study that connected the presence of this parasite in the brain to entrepreneurship.
Okay. What?
Because of the risk-taking factor, probably.
Yeah. Well, that's how we started our podcast.
Exactly. You guys both have parasite in your head. But here's where the free will and personality stuff gets interesting. What if a lab like mine one day comes up with a cure and we can get rid of this parasite that is in our head? And outside of personality, there is a legitimate medical case to be made to get this parasite out of our heads, because for immunocompromised people, it can become life-threatening. So we want to be able to cure it. But what if we do? What if we can get rid of all these encysted parasites in the head of someone who is kind of this high-risk entrepreneur? What would we do to them if they don't have those personality traits anymore because they were driven by this parasitic infection? Wow. So it really it drives one more nail, I guess, in the coffin of free will, if you think about it, because people could be having microbes or microbiome issues that are making them people that they normally wouldn't be, or vice versa.
Yeah.
Maybe to some degree they would still stay the same, in the sense that they've sort of trained themselves to operate a certain way. It depends on the person. I guess if a child is treated for this, of course, the root of their lives are going to take a completely different route. But I wonder if an adult treated with this, maybe it would lead to some changes, but maybe not like a huge.
Alan's like, let me keep my free will, man.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. No, because you would think the way that certain behaviors kind of formed, and like what you're sort of conditioned to do and your pattern.
Right.
Yeah. So yes, the impulsiveness maybe would be, I don't know, something to think about.
No, Alan, I think that's a very viable point. We don't want to simplify something as complex as behavior to just being driven by a single entity, like a parasitic infection. There could certainly be other overlapping phenomena that could be at play, and most likely are, because risk-taking is a complex behavior. But then you read some cases where things seem to be ridiculously simple. Okay. Both of you guys are probably familiar with this classic case in neuroscience and psychology where there was an individual.
Phineas Gage.
No.
Oh, no?
That is another classic one. But that really just shows how important the brain is, in terms of behavior and personality. But there's another one that speaks to kind of the free will question. So someone developed pedophilia, later in their life.
Yeah.
And, had heinous thoughts about all sorts of things. And long story short, it turned out that this individual had a tumor in their brain that was pressing up against one of the areas that was linked to, I guess, attraction or something like that. I don't know the specifics, but they removed that tumor and this pedophilia went away. It disappeared, which, it's pretty mind-blowing in and of itself. But then to kind of seal the deal, over time, the tumor grew back, and with it, the pedophilia came back as well. So this is just a really interesting case that can illustrate how things are happening in the brain that we're totally not aware of, that could be affecting even some of the most darkest behaviors that human beings can have. And I raise this point not only because we've been discussing free will and personality changes. I mean, that's one of the most striking examples of a personality change you can imagine. Right. But this also speaks to the idea that this sort of knowledge is power. And if even the most heinous, behaviors have a biological cause, are we going about jurisprudence in the correct way? Yeah. Is it right to punish someone because they had a tumor in their head that led them to do a certain behavior? No question they have to be confined. Okay, we have to protect society. But in those sorts of cases, there's really no reason to be punitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is something that happened outside of their control. If this happened to you, you wouldn't want to be punished for it because you didn't consciously make these decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just another interesting spin. This comes up in free will discussions all the time. If there's no free will, then how in the world are we to go about having any sort of justice in the world?
Right. Ooh, so okay, wow, this opens up so much. So this makes me think. So what's interesting is you have so Bill, I don't know how much you know about this, but there's like this really kind of ongoing and big debate between let's say the more or less, let's say what we would call anti-psychiatry, and then the other kind of proponents, the psychologists and psychiatrists who say, well, I mean, there's a biopsychosocial model, right? So what you would have in anti-psychiatry is you would have this binary distinction between like organic mental illness, and then you would have what they would call like the social constructs, right? But what's so interesting about something like that is that when you think about now epigenetics, is it now actually, and I'm not, maybe this is way too simplistic, maybe it's just me going, oh, of course this makes sense, and maybe it's much more complicated than that, but this is what I'm seeing, right? So like, yes, what you're saying obviously makes a lot of sense, and I think those are the more prominent organic illnesses where we could just say, okay, here's the single cause, right? But here's the thing, right? So okay, with anti-psychiatry, they would say, well, yeah, of course, like this person had a tumor, so of course he was like, let's say, became a pedophile, and he was cured, healed, whatever, and then like he moved on, right? So they would say something along the lines of, but for the psychologist, psychiatrist, or whatever, right, there's no such thing as depression. So they would make the argument that, well, here's the thing, depression, like there's so many of them, right? So we have dysthymia, we have mild major depression, we have moderate major depression, severe major depression, right? We have grief disorder, yada yada. So they would say there's so many different versions of depression, right? So how does it make sense that these are not social constructs? Whereas on the biological side, we can obviously see again the tumor, but here, where again, how do you pinpoint it? We can't even pinpoint the genes, right? That are, well, not that we can't pinpoint the genes, we can't actually say for sure which genes cause like which particular depressive episode. But what I'm also hearing is, based on what you're saying, if it is this dimmer switch, right, that actually fits depressive episodes. So if, let's say, the dimmer switch is kind of like, let's say, increased to some extent, then of course it's going to go from what we call dysthymia, which is like chronic low level depression, and then it's going to become a little bit more moderate, right? And if that dim switch is increased even further, then it's going to become a little bit more severe than that. So it's like, on the one hand, we're saying, yeah, sure, obviously, the more biological, they're all biological, but the ones that are more evident, right? The more evident biological sources are obviously true, yes, and they're organic. But then I would say, but they're all organic, right? So even though, like, and I guess this goes into the question of justice, right? What is justice? Because maybe it's not even fair to punish, like, let's say, the people who don't have a tumor as opposed to those who are. But I guess the question for me, Bill, is for you: do you think that in terms of mental illness, that there should be kind of a binary way of viewing it, or do you feel like, as genetic studies kind of increasing, improving, are we actually starting to see that no, there are really fundamental genetic components to everything, and epigenetics is actually a big part of it?
Yeah, those are really great questions. Probably take a while to unpack there because there's so many different layers. I think the biggest mistake we can make at this juncture is believing that there's a one size fits all solution.
Mm-hmm.
I think mental health is too large of a black box for us to go in and start definitively making concrete cases that this is the way to treat someone for this condition. I think there's too many different levels, like you were articulating, to mental illness, and it affects people in very different ways. I can certainly speak to the epigenetics component. There's been studies done along those lines, and I think this brings us into the realm of, if we can control environments, we may be able to get a better handle in treating mental health. And the experiment that comes to mind is one that deals with ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. Classic experiment. You can do these in rodent models, but they've also been done in humans. I don't think it's any surprise that, when children are exposed to ACEs, bullying, neglect, and so on, when they are very young, even if they get into a better environment later, they still have a much higher predisposition for depression, for aggression, violent behavior, and things of this sort. Tragic scenario, because none of these kids ever signed up for this, during their lifetime, but they seem to have these psychological scars with them as they grow into adults. So it's easy to just point to the psychology of all of this and say, well, yeah, of course, if I would have been subjected to that, I'd probably be the same way. But as a biologist, I'm like, well, why? What is the mechanism behind all of this? And researchers have been tying epigenetics to this. So if you look at the brains of, unfortunately, children exposed to ACEs, they're also higher risk of suicide in adulthood. So if you look at some of those brains post-mortem, you can find epigenetic changes that took place at stress response genes. So what that is telling us is that children exposed to ACEs are being epigenetically reprogrammed to expect stress and trauma all the time. And they don't seem to be able to grow out of that. There seems to be a window in childhood where maybe these epigenetic changes get fairly stable. And, we haven't figured out a way to destabilize those yet. But long story short, at the end of the day, these children, as they grow into adults, are basically their genetic activity has been tweaked to always be hypervigilant, paranoid, and on the defensive in terms of their stress response, which not only has severe mental health consequences, behavioral problems, but it's also bad physiologically. I mean, to be in that chronic state of stress is sending cortisol through the body 24/7, and that's we also have higher predispositions for physiological diseases like cardiovascular disease and cancer.
Yeah.
So there's certainly an epigenetic component to everything you said. And I think that's going to be one of the arenas in the future of research that gets a lot more attention, because in addition to tweaking environment to maybe reversing some of those epigenetic changes, there's further hope in the development of epigenetic drugs. Right. So those are coming online now, and some are in clinical trials. So it'll be really interesting to see if we can utilize epigenetic drugs to kind of, manipulate these dimmer switches to a more healthy level.
Interesting. Do you mind if I ask something? Okay. Which like ones do you find promising, or like, is there any one particular epigenetic drug or a set of them that have piqued your interest?
Or treatment more broadly?
No, because I love futuristic technologies. You also talk about brain-computer interfaces as well.
Yeah. Fascinating area.
Yeah, I'm curious what's piqued your interest specifically. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'll touch on the epigenetic drugs first. These are still highly experimental because, like I said, the epigenetics field is literally just a couple decades old. So it's extremely new in terms of science. But epigenetic drugs, at least in some animal models, look like they're having some promise. There was one I wrote about in the Psychology Today article where Shelley Berger at UPenn was able to reprogram an ant's behavior. Okay, ants are a really great model to study because in a colony, they're all the same. They're all identical twins. Yet some grow into large soldiers and some stay small and they have foraging activities. Very different morphologies, very different phenotypes, but they have this same exact genome. So this is controlled through epigenetic changes. And Shelley Berger recognized this. And she did two amazing things. First of all, she injected this epigenetic drug into an ant's brain, which is kind of mind-blowing in and of itself. But when she did that, she could convert the soldier ants into foragers. So this drug was literally changing the epigenetic landscape, the dimmer switches on their genes, and literally changing their destiny, giving them a different job in life. So there have been clinical trials utilizing epigenetic drugs to fight cancer, because in a lot of times what happens in cancer is that there's these genes called tumor suppressors that naturally defeat cancers. Right. And many cancerous cells shut those genes off by this DNA methylation mark that we talked about at the very beginning. They methylate those tumor suppressor genes, and therefore the body can't defeat the tumor as it naturally would. Some of these epigenetic drugs seem to be capable of turning those tumor suppressors back on and allows the cancer to naturally defeat itself. So that was like the first go-to experiment. that researchers wanted to do because they had a clear clinical usage.
Mhm.
The problem with these therapies is that they're non-specific right now. So we don't know which dimmer switches these drugs are going to manipulate.
Right.
But you probably heard of CRISPR gene editing tools, okay?
Yeah.
These are remarkably specific gene editing tools that could be adapted, conjugated to these epigenetic drugs, right? So then we would have the specificity to target a specific epigenetic drug to a particular gene and either turn it up or turn it down, how, whatever would be needed in that case. So I think there's a really exciting future ahead for epigenetic drugs.
Wow.
Wow. Wow.
Did you want to ask about the other technology?
Oh, for sure. I'm sorry. I'm just
No,
in such amazement because I'm like thinking, oh wow, what is the potential of that in the future? And imagine if that was commercialized.
Mhm.
Like somebody's marketing like
Ask your doctor.
entrepreneurial pill
Mhm.
or I don't know, genius pill, for
Oh,
instance.
I think they beat you to it, Alan. I think if
Yeah.
you do a search, you'll find all sorts of
Well, yeah.
compounds for epigenetic health or something like this. Total snake oil at this point.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like you get a little bit of knowledge, and I can understand the excitement. I get excited about it myself. But
Yeah.
to then make this tremendous leap to market a pill that is completely untested and offering it to people, yeah, that breaches ethical boundaries, in my opinion.
Yeah, you know what's so funny? I'm going to bring it up now. So we were actually offered a sponsorship for a nootropic, and we decided ultimately against it. So Bill, do you know about like nootropics and what they actually market? Just curious.
No,
Oh,
I'm not
so
sure. Go ahead.
oh, so it's kind of like that. It's like a brain stimulant or whatever, right? So it's essentially
Okay.
like it's like a drink, like kind of like a Alan's gonna look it up. So it's like a caffeine drink, and it's supposed to essentially not necessarily increase your IQ, but at least increase your brain activity, whatever that means. But it gets you to the point where you're like, whatever, 10 times more productive. So yeah, and pretty much from the study that I read, which was like a wholesale study, not on the particular brand, it was on a bunch of different brands at the time. And so essentially the scientists, the researchers, they essentially argued that there was no actual evidence for any sort of benefit.
So the claim is that essentially, generally speaking, what a nootropic is that it's a cognitive enhancer. These
Yeah.
are drugs that are used in an attempt to improve memory, mental alertness, concentration, boost energy levels, and wakefulness. Some of the most common sorts of nootropics, for instance, caffeine, L-theanine, theacrine, bacopa, monieri, creatine, rhodium. Now, by the way, somebody looking on the surface, and sees what I just listed, they're like, no, of course, these are good for you. It's just that what these people who market these nootropics and what they put in there, saying it's going to increase your cognitive ability and
Yeah.
do all these wonderful things. It's sort of a stretch. Let's put it that way. But is L-theanine good for you, for instance? Yes. Can
No.
caffeine be good for you? I suppose in a certain quantity, sure.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So then my question to you, Bill, is like, so in terms of the actual, let's say gene medicines, if you want to call them that. So how do we then kind of stay away from the snake oil stuff? Because it's kind of hard to know, especially in the free market that we obviously live in. It's hard to know like what is and isn't legitimate. When you do have guys, and I'm going to just say it, like Andrew Huberman and people like that who essentially and they are legitimate neuroscientists. So, and they market these pills slash, whatever caffeine, I don't know what you would even call it, I guess drinks. And so, yeah. So how do we essentially know what is in this and bunk?
Yeah, that's a really good analogy, guys, because it basically mirrors what we just described for these charlatans who are pitching epigenetic drugs. They take a little residue, a kernel of truthful evidence. Okay, yeah, caffeine's a brain stimulant, no duh. We know the molecular mechanism behind that, in fact. And to a certain point, yeah, it can, over a short-term basis, give you a little bit of a boost. That's no secret. There's other compounds that can probably act in similar ways. And they take that little kernel of truth, which warrants further investigation, don't get me wrong, but then they put the cart before the horse and say, this is going to help you do this, 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 and this. What you see in an animal model, or even worse, a tissue culture model, almost always doesn't translate perfectly into the in vivo situation, because when you ingest these drugs, they are metabolized in all sorts of different ways. and you don't know what you're getting at the end of the day. Do these drugs actually get to the brain where they're supposed to be working? The brain is notoriously impenetrable to many different types of drugs. But even if they did have evidence of that in a mouse model, I would not feel comfortable wasting my money or using my body as a guinea pig unless I saw a randomized, double-blind, random, controlled study. And that's what I want at the end of the day, a bona fide clinical trial with enough participants to show me statistically significant results.
Yeah. And with the nootropics from, again, the major study that I read, essentially that the healthcare professionals who I guess based their conclusions or whatever on the study. So they essentially said that it was recommended for some neurodegenerative diseases. I don't remember which ones. I don't know. I think Alzheimer's was one of them, but I might be mistaken. But essentially they said for everyday people, like just, like you and me or whatever, right? They said there are no visible benefits to them. So it's, again, kind of interesting how it's marketed. So the idea is like, sure, in some very limited cases, these could actually be demonstrably beneficial, but for the most part, I mean, you probably shouldn't waste your money on it.
I couldn't agree more. And what people also don't realize, and it's very surprising, is that this is a completely unregulated industry. You can put anything you want in a pill and on a bottle and market it. It's absurd. We should not be able to do that. And because you could be endangering people's lives. A lot of these people might take this compound and they're on some other drug for a legitimate medical reason.
Right.
And studies haven't been done to test interactions between those drugs. You can have a very serious drug interaction that, that could have been completely prevented. So this is a lot of Russian roulette in terms of, take this. Well, who made it? What's the quality control? What sort of trial was conducted to, bolster these claims? And what sucks at the end of the day is some of these things might be right. Okay. Some of them might actually pan out and prove to be helpful, but people should not put faith in that until the proper studies have been done, because more often than not, it's not going to work the way it is promised.
Yeah.
And that's the best case scenario. Worst case scenario, it could actually do harm to you. Not only by your wallet, but physically could harm you.
Yeah, totally. I mean, of course, we're going to be ending soon. I feel that, but I guess I should bring up peptides, for instance, right? So let's say,
I'm sorry, what, for instance?
Peptides, right? Which
okay,
are now also being somewhat commercialized, at least online, right? Of course, there are studies on them, but not enough, depending which peptide you're talking about. Let's say ipamorelin or ceramorelin or
wait, I'm sorry, Al, can you just say what because I don't even know what those are. What are peptides? What do they do?
So essentially, peptides. So essentially, your body makes peptides, right? But it's sort of an injectable drug that you'll place into your like adipose tissue, like fatty tissue, either in your stomach, leg, arm, some fatty part of your body. You inject it, and essentially, these different peptides have different sorts of effects. Like there's something called BPC 157, which is being touted as this amazing. It's amazing in terms of like boosting healing in your body. However, the amount of studies that have been done on it in mice, it's like it shows promising effects, and people even anecdotally say it's amazing.
Of course.
But at the same point, even if it is, let's say it is actually great, still it's not studied enough to see how it interacts with like other drugs. What other effects could it have?
Long-term effects,
like downstream effects. Let's bring into for example, ipamorelin, which will actually cause your body to will cause your I forget how essentially you secrete more growth hormone in your body.
So it's a steroid?
Well, not quite, not quite. But because you're not necessarily, it's not like you're injecting a steroid and it doesn't exactly mess with your liver or something. But the main point is though, anyway, what are the dangers of having too much, or not too much, but generally speaking, if you produce more growth hormone than you otherwise would, it's indiscriminate what parts of your body anyway grow from growth hormone. You could grow cancer, I mean, sorry, like a tumor,
tumors,
or something like that. It's not as dangerous as like actual injecting of growth hormone or testosterone, but still, like, these things aren't being researched, well enough yet. There is literature, but it's not probably where it needs to be at, and people are selling these sorts of things.
Right.
So
Yeah, and then Bill, actually, then I want to actually pose you a question as we start to wrap up. So when you have, again, we live in a free market system. So when you have an industry that's actually just meant to pump out research that supports products that obviously entrepreneurs, with or without the parasite, essentially promote, right? Sort of like, how do we make this a more or less well-regulated system? Because the FDA is obviously going to be limited just based on personnel, funding, et cetera, right? So how do we then try to, or begin to start to think about managing it?
That's a tough question. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It is not going to be welcoming regulation in any way, shape, or form, because too many people are getting rich off of innocent customers who either don't know better or who are desperate. And modern science can't do something for them, so they're going to take their chances with these questionable therapies. So that is a really excellent question. It's much more political in nature because that's where it has to get approved. And the FDA has got to get on top of this. But we can follow a model of like European nations, for example, who will not allow certain products to get out there unless you can back up the claim with a bona fide study. And to me, that just makes common sense. And I would just appeal to the consumer, because that's really all we can do right now. Since I agree with you, I don't see government change happening anytime soon, as much as I feel that it should. We have to educate consumers that, hey, what you're putting into your body at best might not be doing anything other than wasting your money, and at worst could be causing you harm. The peptide thing, just to come back to that real quick, peptides are little bits of protein, okay? And they can do a whole bunch of different things. Some of them act as hormones, some of them bind to receptors in cells of your body, maybe even your brain. They do all sorts of things. So insulin, for example, is a peptide, and people inject that. I've seen peptides in the form of pills as well, or powders, which is really disturbing, because you put those into your stomach, which is filled with acid. Those peptides are like proteins. They're going to break right down. I don't see how in the world that can benefit anybody, because it's not going to go to where it needs to go.
right.
Injectable might be, a better way to deliver it, but it's still empty promises until you can produce a study that says, in tens of thousands of human beings, when they injected this particular dose, one, it was safe, and two, it produced this statistically significant change. I think there's a lot of placebo effect going on in those anecdotal stories.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
All right. So, Alan, as we start to wrap up, any final questions for Bill?
Yes. Well, actually, very quick comment. By the way, I just wanted to let you know, as a reader of the book, I really appreciated the humor.
Oh,
Right.
thank you.
Oh my God, it was so fun, because there was this part where you're talking about memory and how our memories are never accurate. We're always recreating our memories, and then you're talking about how you have trouble remembering that you have to get raspberries at the grocery store for your wife. So you bring up, I use 80 songs to remember, things. So you use that Prince song, Raspberry Beret,
Yeah.
and then did the lyrics, but changed it into a way, remembering to buy the
She
raspberries.
needs raspberries today.
Yeah, 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 stuff like that. It was just very pleasurable, as far as that goes, reading the book. But what
Well,
I
thank
wanted,
you. That's I really appreciate that, because that kind of made the slog of writing a book a lot more enjoyable, was to kind of have fun with the topic. And I know, as a science communicator, people need that sort of break when they're trying to unpack things like DNA methylation.
Yes.
absolutely. And so, if we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where can we do that?
Oh yeah, thanks for bringing that up. The easiest place to go to would be my author website. It's author.billsullivan.com. From there, you can find links to the book, as well as all my social media channels, and newer articles that I have written, many of which are related to the book or have updated studies related to the topics of the book.
Yeah, I love that.
So,
And Bill, man, so I've been reading your Psychology Today articles. You are literally now one of my favorite writers.
Oh, thank
absolutely.
you so much.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that, and I want to thank you guys so much for having me on. This has been a fantastic conversation. I had a lot of fun.
Absolutely. It
Absolutely.
was a
We'll talk to
pleasure.
you soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.
All right. That was awesome, I have to say. So, everyone, If you would like to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On Twitter, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.